Alright, I want to start this one out on a personal note. I hope that's okay with you. If not, buckle up, because this is going to be a ride.
Cool, yeah.
If you can actually believe it, Ant Man was the first film I ever reviewed on YouTube, like ever, back when the channel used to be Men vs. Movies. And if you were around since Men vs. Movies, God love you. You're the best. So Ant Man in general has a lot of special meaning to me in that regard, but I think over the years it's just been the MCU film I enjoy revisiting the most because of how breezy it is, how fun it is, how surprisingly character-driven and emotional it is. It's fun and genuinely funny, creative. Paul Rudd is fucking perfect. Then again, when is Paul Rudd not perfect? The gravitas of Michael Douglas, he's the anchor that brings this whole thing together with a genuinely compelling performance. And come on, Corey Stoll is a fantastic villain. But even more than that, Ant-Man just does its own thing. It exists within the MCU and doesn't try to act like it doesn't, but it also isn't concerned with the MCU at large, isn't playing the setup game. It's just concerned with telling stories about their characters, about everyday people who just happen to have some shrinking technology. And I know that's kind of the shtick of these films. They're the palate cleanser to the big event films. They're small, both in terms of scale and stakes and all that good stuff. And that's great. I enjoy that about those movies, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a lot to offer. In fact, I would say that because they're not burdened with carrying the larger story of the MCU, that they're able to just kind of take a step back and tell really compelling stories about fathers and their daughters and sons and family and all that great stuff. It's a breath of fresh air when you're watching through the monotony of the MCU at times. It feels like it has its own unique identity and style and flair. Now, granted, maybe that has a bit to do with Edgar Wright's initial involvement, but that doesn't mean that director Peyton Reed needed to stick with it. He could have gone off and done his own thing and just completely scrapped what Edgar Wright had been working on, but he didn't because he saw the potential in that story, in the idea of Ant-Man, and particularly this interpretation of Ant-Man where Hank Pym isn't necessarily the main protagonist, or at least the young, hip protagonist. I don't know. By introducing Scott Lang, the second Ant-Man, as our main protagonist here, I think the filmmakers are able to do a lot of really interesting things in terms of talking about generational parenting and mentorship and exploring the early days of S.H.I.E.L.D. and all that good stuff. But stripping all that away for a second, the idea on jump, the idea of Ant-Man is inherently fun. Of course, every superpower is fantastical and filled with a youthful sense of wonder, but there's really something inherently playful and childlike about the idea of shrinking. The idea of these superheroes shrinking and then duking it out on the bedroom floor or what have you evokes the feeling of kids playing with their toys. They're down there in a small area imagining a much larger world. In a sense, it sort of opens up your imagination a bit, forces you to be creative in ways you hadn't considered before, which I think comes through in the film, whether it be in the planning of the heist or in the final action sequence with Thomas the Tank Engine. There's just an endearing playfulness to these films that I think makes them so rewatchable. They're harmless, and yeah, I know people don't really like them as much as me. I'm obviously in the minority here and thinking that Ant-Man is the best solo origin outing in the MCU. Yeah, it even is better than the first Iron Man or Captain America: The First Avenger. Two films I genuinely love, but it takes the idea of superheroes and why that appeals to kids, why kids fall in love with heroes, and then it kind of modulates that a bit in different ways. And because of that youthful sense of play, Ant-Man as a film focuses on why heroes are important to kids. And that's a real part of the beauty of Ant-Man. And then it takes that a step further and explores that through father-daughter, or really just like parental relationships. And that is a real part of the beauty of Ant-Man. It's a story about fatherhood, obsessive fathers who do bad things that drive a wedge between them and the people they love, whether it's Hank and Hope or Scott and his ex-wife and Cassie. Hank obsessively spent his life trying to find a solution to bring back Janet after she went subatomic, something he feels he shoulders the blame for, and as a result, he neglects his daughter, Hope. Scott chose a life of crime, which caused his wife to take his daughter away from him, and she winds up dating a cop. But putting all of that through the comic book film lens allows that inherently heavy subject matter to feel light, to feel seen through a more childlike lens, to explore the idea of heroes as parents. This is a smaller scale film with real stakes that, while small in comparison to the rest of the MCU, are given weight because of the personal connection to the characters. The Ant Man films thrive on character and telling intimate family stories, especially this first one. They're stories that exist within the MCU without being the driving force or dealing in world-ending catastrophes, which is why Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania I'm a little nervous about, but whatever. At the end of the day, Ant-Man is a real human story about everyday struggles with a slight sprinkling of the fantastical, and that in turn makes this film extraordinary. On its most basic level, Ant-Man might be the most human, grounded, and relatable film in the MCU because Scott is just a guy trying to atone for the wrongdoings of his past and be a good father. At its core, Scott does this heist so he can score enough money to pay child support for his daughter and see her. I mean, Scott Lang really isn't even a hero in this sense. He just sort of falls into the Ant-Man costume, and the entire film is about him becoming the hero his daughter sees him as, which is just such a deeply profound and emotional motif to explore. Scott's just a guy trying to be the best, most supportive and present dad he possibly can be, and it's tough when society largely rejects him due to his criminal record. The fact that he has a master's in electrical engineering and still struggles to find employment because of a past mistake is kind of quite the indictment on the American criminal justice system and the workplace. How can you expect ex-cons to fall back into the workplace and contribute in a meaningful way to society if you won't even afford them the opportunity? Especially someone with the skill set and intellect as Scott. He can provide real value, yet all anyone sees is his record, and that's something he has to carry with him for the rest of his life. It's why becoming a superhero is a monumental thing for him. It allows him to do something that has meaning, something good, and something his daughter can be proud of him for. The MCU typically focuses on larger-than-life heroes, people who most of us will never be and can never truly relate to, which is why someone like Scott Lang is a perfect hero for so many of us. By shrinking the idea of the superhero down to our level, we're truly able to empathize with Scott and his situation. Hell, even relate, given the fact that he's just a dad who wants to pay for his daughter's child support. He just wants to feel as though he's deserving of the endless love Cassie has for him. He has to prove his worth to himself as much as he has to Cassie. Same with Hank in a sense. They both want to feel worthy of the love their children have for each other. That's something every parent goes through. Every parent wants to feel as though they're deserving of their child's love. We can also relate to Scott's financial struggles, employment struggles of just trying to make ends meet to survive. This isn't a billionaire, super soldier, god, giant green monster, genius, scientist, or assassin. Ant-Man is just a guy like you and me. What's so great about the introduction to Scott and his world is how sad it is. Like, it really fits the Edgar Wright signature muted blue color palette, and Paul Rudd is the perfect guy to play that happy, sad protagonist. Someone whose life is in shambles, has been completely crushed by the system, and whose friends around him have had their world equally as crushed. Luis telling stories about his mom dying, dad getting deported, it's all played for comedy, but like, it's sad. By going to prison, he lost out on all of that, and it's the same situation with Scott and Cassie. The fact that Scott can't even maintain a job at Baskin-Robbins because of his criminal record is really sad. You know, like the one place you think he should be able to find work, minimum wage, fast food chain. It's so effective in depicting the brutal world Scott lives in, the beginning with the prison beatdown, even if it was for fun, and then him walking on the street. Society devoid of the resources to help someone in a position like that get back on their feet. And then when you find out about Scott's crime, it just makes you feel for him even more. Like, fuck yeah, Scott, you should have stuck it to those rich assholes who screwed you over and got away with a white-collar crime. I think it's brilliant that we never actually see the Vista job, but it's constantly referenced, and all of these common people revere Scott for really sticking it to people who are genuinely the bad guys. It shows he's a criminal, quote-unquote, with a conscience, someone with a righteous core of beliefs who's always, even before he became the Ant-Man, looking out for the little guy. Let's rewind a bit. The film opens with a prologue set in 1989, where Hank Pym goes to talk to S.H.I.E.L.D. about the potential dangers of the Pym particles. They think everything he's saying is superfluous, stupid, like he hasn't considered the actual implications of his creation. What's so great about this is it sets up the elite versus the working class dynamic pretty early on. Even if, you know, Hank Pym isn't really the most working class kind of guy, but, you know, there's still a power dynamic, a wealth elitist dynamic here. And compared to the Starks, I guess we're all just kind of ants and small working class guys. I mean, you get it. Hank storms into the S.H.I.E.L.D. boardroom because they were trying to replicate the Pym particle behind his back in an effort to weaponize it. Specifically, Stark was trying to do that. Hank is constantly told he was to be in Moscow on an op, that he has no business in the boardroom, that he's a soldier with no autonomy and he's just supposed to follow orders. They're stepping on him like an ant. But Hank definitely gives off the vibe that his research is all he has, and he's proud of that. He's proud of the scientific discovery he's made, but he doesn't trust people, a big character flaw that leads to a lot of different problems for him. And he doesn't want it to fall into the hands of anyone other than him. He's clearly very protective of it, just like most innovators who create the one thing everyone else is after. This is also an instance where Hank is letting the vanishing of his wife, or I guess at this point it was the death of his wife, dictate how he lives his life and how he devotes himself. It gives us an insight into the ways he has closed himself off to not just the public, but also to his daughter, Hope. How he has ruined some of the most important relationships in his life by trying to protect them, by having to have his hand on the wheel of everything. And that is something that allowed our villain to take shape. Darren Cross. Oh, who doesn't love Darren Cross? Come on. When you're ranking these MCU villains, Darren Cross as Yellow Jacket has to be towards the top of the list because he's just so damn fun. Darren is Hank's prodigy who was in pursuit of his approval and admiration and love. There's a pseudo father-son dynamic going on here that Hank is able to improve upon when he meets Scott. Darren's blinded by ambition and devolves into carrying out his plan out of spite for Hank. Hank, neglecting his prodigy, not being a good mentor, and keeping Darren away, pushed him away and pushed him to become someone worse. He's a monster of Hank's own making. He allowed Darren to go and create his own version of the Pym particle with the Yellow Jacket and sell it as a weapon to the highest bidder. Even the S.H.I.E.L.D. guy from the prologue wants in. I mean, he's technically Hydra at this point, but still, it doesn't really matter. Hank burying his research on the Pym particle allowed it to fall into the wrong hands. Darren's hands. Instead of falling inward and bogarting his innovation that could be used for the good of mankind, the very thing he didn't want to have happened because he repressed, thinking no one would be able to crack the secret to his formula. Darren did, but it turned out much deadlier and worse, and was revealed to a bunch of potential buyers as a weapon, essentially turning Pym Technologies into an arms dealer, which is the very last thing that Hank wanted. This allows for Scott to enter this story at a very interesting point for not only himself, but also for Hank and Hope. Scott is, on a base level, all about about helping people, standing up for the little guy, as we've already discussed, even if it means that something bad is going to happen to him. He's selfless. He proves this time and time again throughout the MCU as a superhero, but he's been doing this even before he was put in jail, before we even see him on screen. What's interesting with Hank's intentions with Scott is that he essentially wants to use him to prevent his technology from coming out into the open, but he's also using Scott because Scott's expendable. He's so scared of losing someone else who's close to him, Hope, that he'll put someone else's life at risk. Someone who's desperate, already has a criminal record, and can be thrown under the bus if things go wrong. Instead of going with the person who could get the job done, do it right and cleanly, especially given her understanding of the suit and the shrinking abilities and Darren and the environment they're breaking into, Hank wrongly puts someone else at risk. Hope has done everything to try and have a relationship with her father, with Hank. You get the sense that she felt that doing this job for him would allow him to see her for the capable woman she's become, the highly trained, intelligent daughter. Because Hank pushed her further and further away, she tried to appeal to him by taking interest in the things he did, and you can see from the beginning that it's still not quite working. He doesn't really see her, he just uses her like he does everyone else. And while this tragedy unfolds in the Pym household, Scott has his own heavy choices to make when taking on this job. He's the one with everything to lose, and yet he agrees to do it because of what it could mean for repairing his relationship with his daughter.
I've missed so much time and I want to be a part of her life.
Just be the person that she already thinks you are.
This is essentially Scott's whole journey throughout the film, living up to how his daughter sees him. Scott is so desperate to see his daughter and be a part of her life. By his calculations, it'll take over a year to get the money at his current rate. He feels he has no choice but to go back to what he was doing and go for another score in order to see her. He's essentially in a no-win scenario, so he really just has to make the best of two less than ideal decisions. This leads us to what kicks the movie into high gear, the Hank house heist, as I'm dubbing it. This sequence is amazing because it shows Scott's ability to think quickly on his feet and his resourcefulness, even in the most seemingly impossible situations. It's a great way of showing that despite Scott not being necessarily the smartest quote-unquote guy in the room or a seemingly simple guy, I don't know, the vibe that Paul Rudd gives off, he's actually way more capable and bright than people give him credit for. I love how this job was supposed to be the job that allows him to save his relationship with Cassie, allows him to be the hero she sees him as, and he thought that meant finding money in a safe, solving his financial troubles literally, but in actuality, it's finding the Ant Man suit, a calling that will forever change his life. He will literally become the hero. But first, he hits another low. Scott gets caught while robbing, or I guess returning the suit to Hank's house. He sits in the interrogation room, waiting to end up back in jail, thinking he failed, thinking that all he is trying to do, the relationship he so desperately wants to have with Cassie, is something he just lost again. Then, someone comes in to talk to him. Hank works Scott to the point where he has no choice but to do what he wants him to. Hank doesn't really care about Scott, but he is opportunistic. He sees Scott's desire to be with his daughter, his restlessness and thief skill set, and seeks to use it, hence why he's set up when Scott tries to return the suit. He knows that if faced with prison or a way out that may help him be with his daughter again, he'll go with that second option. It really just puts into perspective how everyone is a pawn in Hank's selfish game. I do ultimately think that Hank is a good guy though, albeit a bit troubled. He's got a darkness to him that's also there in the comics, and it comes through in his relationships with most everyone else. In fact, I'd say that the Hank Pym in the Ant Man movies is pretty damn close to the way that he was conceived and written in those original comics. Pretty hard-headed and set in his ways and very protective over his work. He's also his own worst enemy, which is the quintessential Hank Pym trait.
I've spent years carrying around my anger for Hank Pym. I devoted my genius to him. Could have worked anywhere. I chose my mentor poorly. You didn't even have a choice. But we shouldn't be angry, we should be grateful. Because his failures as a mentor as a father, forced us to spread our wings.
Well, that's all well and good, Darren, but we all know that you're full of shit and you still really want Hank's admiration and approval. Darren was so clearly scorned by how Hank treated him, and yes, Hank created his own demons, but Darren never got out of the relationship, never stopped trying to win the approval of someone who wasn't invested in giving it to him, wasn't interested in giving him the support and approval he so craved. It's a lost cause, and you can understand it, you can come to terms with it, but you can't let it define you and your actions, just like it has with Darren. Darren's working out of spite, even clinging onto a sliver of hope that Hank might just give him a crumb of something to let him know that he's done a good job, or that Hank will feel regretful, remorseful, and recognize the mistake he made in letting Darren go, in pushing Darren away like that. Darren talks like he's past all of that now, that he should be grateful for all of that because it allowed him to become his own person, but in actuality, he's just lying to himself. And the fact that he tries to relate to Hope, thinking that he and Hope are in the same position when they're not. Yes, Hope has her own issues with Hank as a father, and she definitely feels resentment towards him, but it's her father. She does what she can to still have a relationship with him. She sees why Darren is dangerous and why it's worth helping her father to take down a greater evil, but at the same time, you get the sense that she's doing this to grow a bit closer to him. Corey Stoll is just perfect as a villain, as we've mentioned countless times throughout this video, and he's a perfect villain for this film because he just plays a great corporate asshole who's insecure about himself. The film actually does something really interesting with the idea of the Ant-Man as a hero. Parenting, fatherhood is an insanely large mountain to climb. It's no easy feat, and there are going to be a lot of obstacles and times where you feel as small, insignificant, and helpless as an ant. But ants also have incredible strength and accomplish tasks, wonders, feats much larger than themselves. They work as part of a colony, a team. They don't do it alone. And realizing that is what leads to the rest of the ant family in future films. Ant-Man is the ultimate father's superhero metaphor.
Before Hope lost her mother, she used to look at me like I was the greatest man in the world. Now she looks at me and there's just disappointment. This is your chance. The chance to earn that look in your daughter's eyes, to become the hero that she already thinks you are.
This right here is the whole movie. It explains Hank wallowing in his failings as a father and seeing a younger father and trying to help him avoid the same mistakes as him. It's ultimately about two dads working to earn the love and adoration of their children. Hank doesn't realize that all Hope wants is for her father to believe in her, to trust her. She never stopped loving her father, but she did grow increasingly tired of the neglect. Hank stopped being her hero when he stopped trying to be the best version of himself, when he reverted, when he closed himself off. This caused Hope to have to find other methods to cope with the pain she was feeling. She learned martial arts. She became a person with walls so high they felt insurmountable to climb over. Her real feelings are hidden behind those walls of anger. Hank continues after all these years to peddle the lie that Janet died in a plane crash, and again, similar to how he held the truth from Darren about the Ant-Man and Pym Particle, he did the same thing with Hope in regards to how Janet really died.
It's bad enough you won't tell me how she died. Could you please stop telling me that lie?
It's clear Hank still doesn't see Hope as the fully grown, capable woman that she is. He's still feeding her lies like a child, trying to protect her, trying to protect Darren, trying to protect the world. Hank feels as though he has to solely shoulder the burden of everything. He can't share the load, which is ironic given his attachment to ants and how ants operate as a colony, as a team, as a group. I guess it makes sense that Hank's greatest allies would be ants. He can't trust people, but he'll trust a completely different species, especially when he can sort of control them through neural pathways.
But even now he still wants to shut me out.
He doesn't want to shut you out. He trusts you.
Then why are you here?
I'm expendable. That's why I'm here. You must have realized that by now. I mean, it's why I'm in the suit and you're not. He'd rather lose this fight than lose you.
This exchange is so beautiful. It's everything. It establishes how Hope is feeling about Hank, how Hank reacted poorly in the wake of Janet's death, and how that damaged Hope and her relationship with her father during a time when she so desperately needed him. He locked himself away when he should have considered how Hope was also feeling. He should have considered the fact that he was also a father. As Hank himself says, Janet died a hero, and that's something that should be admired, should be celebrated. Hank should use that to fuel Hope's ambitions of wanting to take on the mantle of the Wasp, but he's so bogged down in his own grief and the fact that things didn't go the way he wanted them to and just completely collapses inward. He just falls apart. And he did that for so long that it was nearly detrimental to the most meaningful relationship that he still had in his life, his relationship with his daughter.
I was trying to protect you. I lost your mother. I didn't mean to lose you, too.
Before we continue, let's take a little ant-sized break and talk about some really cool shit in this movie because, oh man, there's a lot of it. Goddamn, the macro photography is fucking genius, and you can tell this idea stemmed from Edgar Wright. It's super effective in placing you in the world of Scott Lang as the Ant-Man when he shrinks. It's kind of scary. Crevices take on different identities. The smallest places become massive locations. It brings so much weight to even the smallest things happening in the story. And all these choices are elevated even further by Christoph Beck's score. God, I love this score so much. I've listened to it more times than I care to admit, but quite frankly, it is the best. The best theme and orchestration in the entire MCU. Yeah, you can fight me on that, Avengers and Captain America and all that bullshit. Christoph Beck's Ant-Man score, that's where it's fucking at. The Ant-Man movies overall have some of the most memorable stylistic qualities of the entire MCU, such as Luis's excellent storytelling montages. I mean, come on, those things were instantly iconic, and even if at this point they've kind of overstayed their welcome and have been played out a bit too much, but you know, it's okay, it still works. Out of all the films in the MCU that claim to be a certain genre, but really just kind of use the trappings of said genre and are largely just another MCU film, Ant-Man is really the only one that fully is a heist film. You don't have to be told this is a heist film. It just is by the nature of the story and the elements and the stakes and the people at play. And just to address it, let's talk about the Falcon fight. Do I wish it wasn't in the movie? Yeah, but for what it's worth, I have enough fun with it. I mean, it is the ultimate test for Scott after all the training. Is it gratuitous? Yeah. Does it feel forced? Yeah, a little bit, but they make the best of it. And isn't that what Ant-Man is all about? Making the best of the little moments? The final act of this entire movie, the final fight, the heist, the chasing of Yellow Jacket, all of this stuff, it's just so fucking cool, man. When Scott is chasing after Darren and he has to climb up the pistol, shrink to fight people, and then he's running across the miniature that looks like the Zoolander school, and all this stuff is blowing up and it's epic, and then it cuts to the wide of what's actually going on. Oh, it's so good. It's so much fun. It's a genius way of having our heroes try and work and outsmart the villain. They have to use shrinking technology, and the fighting style is just so interesting. But even more than that, I mean, like, the heist itself is just a fucking blast, dude. Seeing how Scott employs ants and uses them like he would a utility belt is just so bonkers and insanely cool and fun and whimsy. Honestly, most of this third act feels like Reed channeling Wright, or at least doing what was in his initial script, and it excels. Listen, I don't even care. I gotta be honest here. This is the best climax to a solo film in the MCU, period. Yellow Jacket getting flicked into a bug zapper and that cutaway with the sound effects.
It's okay.
Like, that's fucking funny. That's great comedy, and seeing him get resurrected and turned into this like Yellow Jacket zombie, also so good. But what this really all comes down to is the fact that the climax of Ant Man is so creative, it's funny, there are real stakes. I mean, the whole thing takes place in Cassie's room, for God's sakes. I love how throughout the entire final fight, Darren is just so displeased with Hank's prodigy choice. He's almost insulted by Scott, and that Hank would choose to share the one thing he wanted Hank to share with him with Scott. It's so petty. And in the end, after all of this madness, after Scott and Yellow Jacket fighting on Thomas the Tank Engine and having it look like the fucking Lone Ranger, it's just... But in the end, we get to see Scott's selflessness on full display. In order to defeat Darren, he has to shrink and go subatomic in order to save Cassie. He makes the ultimate sacrifice. Scott falls into a void of his failings as a father. He saves her, but at the cost of being able to be there for her, which he knows is what she needs. This void that is the quantum realm that he falls into as he infinitely shrinks, that's Scott feeling as though he's failed, as though he's undeserving of his child's love. He knows that she deserves better, that she needs something more. But after all of that self-wallowing, self-doubt, it's his daughter's voice that manages to pull him out of the darkness. The voice of a child who loves her father and sees him as the hero he is. It's something every parent knows. You may feel like shit, the worst person in the world, like you failed as a father or a mother or a parent in general, like you can do no right. But when your child needs you, you will be there. You will become the hero they need. The amazing thing about the Ant Man movies is how personal they feel to the characters. This found family is dysfunctional, but it's so clear that they care so deeply for one another. Alone, you feel closed off and scared, but when you have a family, you have hope. Hank gets hope after Scott goes subatomic, after he risks his life, that they may be able to go into the quantum realm and rescue Janet. If Scott was able to return from it, then maybe there's hope for Janet. Hope, the character, not the idea, finally gets her father's approval with the suit he and Janet started for her years ago. It's a great closing to her arc in the film. In the future, these characters sacrifice so much of this love, but in this moment, they just get to appreciate it. Appreciate every small moment of life, of love, and feel as though they've earned that love, as though they are truly the heroes, and that makes us all the heroes of our own story.